I flew 12 tours of duty in Korea, and another 3 in Vietnam. But the most terrifying moment of my life was when my wife told me that she had lung cancer. I don't remember much of the day itself. I do know that it was raining hard. A pine tree collapsed in our front yard, and that arbitrary act finally triggered my tears. My wife hugged me and rocked us back and forth as I stared at the fallen pine, and knew that everything was pointless. It was all a waste. That every happy moment would be lost forever when its final witness died. I was a zombie for 3 days. Then I got the call that made everything worse. A bit of background. My post-military life had led me to a job with the Reno Police Department. It had seemed a perfect choice at the time. My combat training had suited me for the task. The alpine environment soothed my then undiagnosed PTSD, and it had great benefits. Or so I thought, until the phone call revealed that my wife's treatment wouldn't be covered. I was so shocked that I simply said thank you to Timothy from Human Resources and hung up. A few additional phone calls revealed that my military service was extensive enough to leave me with a 7.53-inch scar on my right thigh, and the aforementioned PTSD, but not quite good enough for comprehensive spousal health insurance. Dazed, I spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone. I finally got an anonymous voice from an anonymous hospital to break the news. It would cost upwards of $150,000 to provide my wife with the very best treatment options. It would require a lot of out-of-state travel and likely months of missed work, which is what drove the price tag so high. That was 5 times the value of our house. My wife was going to die. It's impossible to explain what breaking a spirit really means to someone who has never experienced that particular damnation. I'd seen 2 buddies of mine come home from Da Nang with missing arms, and 2 more from Cambodia. Yeah, that's a different secret altogether. Who had each lost a leg above the knee. To a man, they gave dreamlike descriptions of how odd it felt to be missing parts of themselves. It seemed that their brains simply wouldn't accept that their flesh was slowly rotting in a fetid swamp. I think it was a survival mechanism. That's the only way I can explain what I did after I looked down at my shell of a gently sobbing wife, and truly understood that she would soon be at room temperature. Dreamlike, I found myself sneaking into the Reno PD late at night. It was shockingly easy. I waved at Debbie on the way in, then used my clearance to access the Human Resources office at the back of the building. No one was there at 2 a.m. to stop me. I turned on the overhead lights since that seemed less suspicious than bumbling around with a flashlight. The file cabinets were locked, but I'd done a hell of a lot more than tear past locks while I was in Korea, and I quickly had them open. I didn't know what I was looking for until I found it. My health insurance file was relatively thin. Like I said, no one had encouraged me to seek help for the PTSD, and the scar on my leg only left me with the slightest limp. No need for the insurance company to waste money on that expensive doctor, right? At least, that's what the author of the note paperclipped to my file believed. It had been attached to my wife's medical paperwork. Can legally be denied at stage 4 for predicted terminal prognosis. Stall for 4 to 6 weeks at all costs to increase likelihood of metastasization. Tears seemed inadequate. I quietly closed the folder and slipped it back into the drawer filled with dozens of identical files. I paused. My heart was already racing. Being caught here would cost me my job or even my freedom. I'd found what I needed, and could walk away right now. But I plunged my hand back into the drawer and opened another file, where I found another note. Patient's insulin is projected to cost over $3,000 annual by fiscal year 1976. Given his age of 10, lifetime financial obligations would be greatly irresponsible for us to burden. Substituting an NaCl-laced placebo for a single prescription will address the issue permanently. I felt like I was floating above my own body. I pulled out another file. Donor X has paid $50,000 to advance his standing on the liver transplant list. This patient has consequently had his designation downgraded to moderate priority to explain the change in rankings. I couldn't read anymore. I had to act. But no court would accept this stolen evidence. Attempting to smuggle the files out would do nothing other than getting my wife killed faster. This is where I learned to redefine fear. Even in combat, my fear had been relegated to a specific time and place. They could be escaped physically, if not mentally. But in this moment, when I realized that the most important part of my existence was in the hands of a man with neither face nor heart, my blood ran cold in a way that never truly warmed again. I wanted to yell, then scream, then take my service weapon and fire at everything that moved. I saw red. I hated. Instead, I put everything neatly back the way I'd found it, waved to Debbie on the way out, and drove straight back home. That's when my wife told me that she had reached out to her former employer. She'd worked in manufacturing for Northwest Orient Airlines for 10 years, and had hoped the cancer treatment might be covered under a workers' compensation agreement. I was confused for a second. Only a second. Then I remembered why she quit. There had been too many days when she came home coughing uncontrollably. She said that the fumes from the welding floor were getting to her, causing prolonged dizziness, making it hard to breathe. Once she had coughed up blood. Lung cancer. I realized then just how tiny a cog she was in someone else's valuable machine. But this tiny cog was the only reason my world kept turning. We sat in our living room's little window seat that night, rocking slowly back and forth without saying a damn word. Her hair, always resistant to my attempts at taming, gently raked a few loose strands across my chin as I held her close. She smelled like jasmine and flower. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was barely audible. "Promise you won't get mad when it hurts and I snap at you? I don't want that to be your last memory of us." I kissed one knuckle on each finger before whispering, "I promise," into her ear. It was shockingly easy. Because the beginning of the story is the best place for a naive fool to be. Most significant journeys would remain untaken if the traveler knew just how bad the most painful part would hurt. But I was only thinking of one thing as I watched a plane take off from Reno, Tahoe in the distance. Things look a hell of a lot easier when you got nothing to lose. For those of you who are wondering, yes, I really am DB Cooper. No, that's not my real name. For obvious reasons, I need to keep my anonymity. I'm sorry that I can't share more. I wanted to respond to questions that people left in the comments, but for some reason my messages can't be read. I also found out that I have to wait 24 hours between each post. My apologies for any confusion. I'm 88 years old and there are still many things that I don't understand about the internet. I can always turn back, was the mantra that got me past my own inertia. Was I really going to hijack a plane? No, I told myself. I was just setting up for it, not actually doing something wrong. I could always turn back before I became a criminal. Which made sense. I had been a law-abiding citizen for my entire life. I'd nearly died for my country. Then I remembered the note attached to my wife's medical file. The people controlling her fate wanted me to become a widower. That's what I had gotten for following the rules all my life. And suddenly, I didn't feel so bad about destroying the system that was trying to kill my wife. I thought about how shockingly easy it had been to break into the files that were supposedly top secret. The reality is that I had been conditioned to believe in uncrossable boundaries. We all have. Those limits are real simply because we believe in them. But the thought of losing my wife in my early 40s, of spending the next half-century alone, peeled back the visage of a world that had been created through belief and obedience. In its stead was a plan. The pieces fell into place almost of their own accord, and the idea presented itself to me fully formed. I looked for a reason to believe that it wouldn't work, but each possibility generated the same result. If I don't, she will die. So I kissed my wife goodbye 3 days before Thanksgiving. She cried then, not in an angry or combative way, but with tears that were too exhausted to fight. "Please," she whispered. "Trust me," I responded. We looked at each other for several minutes but didn't say another word. That was our entire conversation. It was all that needed to be said, and neither of us could bear any more talking. I extracted $200 in cash, leaving my credit card and driver license at home. I gave a fake name to the motels along the way, changing it each time I had to use one. Dan Cooper, I responded to the man selling tickets at the Portland International Airport. It was the first and last time I ever said the name. For reasons I don't fully understand, people came to use the alias DB Cooper when talking about me. The name stuck. I tried to smile as I handed over cash for the ticket, but my entire face was numb. I paid $20. Flights were much cheaper then, and required no photo ID. He handed me 87 cents in change, and I walked away like someone else was controlling my body. Waiting to board was the worst. I almost turned back when I saw a little girl of about 6 wearing a blue dress and combing a Barbie doll's hair. I considered what I was about to do to her family, and I nearly vomited. Road flares, a voice in my mind interrupted. You're only using road flares that look like a bomb. No one's getting hurt. I almost laughed at the internal voice. I was going to lose everything if they called my bluff. My wife would die alone while I withered in a forgotten federal prison cell, waiting decades to be released back into a life that I no longer wanted. No. Someone was definitely going to get hurt. Sometimes, that's a good thing. My heart nearly jackhammered out of my chest as a stewardess stared curiously at my briefcase while I boarded. I tried to smile. I failed. But I walked confidently past her and headed for the rear of the plane. Like I said, flying was different in the 70s. No one checked any of my bags. The first signs of a combat flashback were stirring as I sat in the back row where I could watch everyone. As soon as I did, the stewardess made a beeline for me. For the moment, I forced the flashback away. I had to. This was it. "Excuse me, miss?" I called, waving slightly. She flashed that fake airline smile and asked me how she could be of assistance. "Bourbon, please," I responded. I felt exhausted already. "Of course," she answered with saccharine sweetness. "Coca-Cola?" I nodded and she turned away. I didn't think I could do it. She returned with my beverages and a grin. After handing them over, she sat right near me in one of those folding seats used only by the airline crew. I wanted to cry. This was too much. I had to give up. Every tool I needed was in my briefcase, but I just wasn't strong enough to use them. Part of me always knew that I would be too weak. As the plane took off, I closed my eyes and did everything I could to hold in the tears. "Going home?" came a voice from behind me. I wiped my eyes and turned around in surprise. "Pardon?" It was the same stewardess who had brought me the bourbon. "Are you heading home for Thanksgiving? It's always crazy for us the day before." Her smile seemed real this time. "I've been in the air for 19 hours straight. All I want to do is get back to my family and take a nice long rest." The first tear finally escaped, but I wiped it away before she could see it. Finally, I smiled too. It was genuine. I pulled the pre-written note from inside my briefcase and handed it to her. "Me too." She took the note politely. My adrenaline spiked. Then she dropped it, unread, into her purse. I frowned. Excuse me, miss?" She seemed irritated now, but the saccharine smile was back in place as she turned to look at me. I waved her closer and leaned forward. "I really think you should read that message." I pulled up my briefcase, but kept it closed for the moment. "I have a bomb." And just like that, there was no turning back. If you ever want to witness a person receiving the shock of their life, try showing them a bomb during a plane flight. I watched the stewardess's face change so fundamentally that I knew she'd never bounce back the same way. It only took one glimpse to have this effect, and that's all I offered her. My copper wire and road flare deception looked real enough, and the shock of the situation drove it firmly home for the poor woman. I closed the briefcase before she could take in every detail. She didn't see how much of the case I was concealing, or how much I had hidden below the flares. And if all went according to plan, no one ever would. Her face had gone paper white, and for the rest of her life, I hope she was remembered for just how cool she remained during an impossible situation. "What do you want from us?" she asked in a stark, businesslike tone. I tried to swallow, but my throat was too dry. $200,000 in unmarked, non-sequential bills. 4 parachutes will be waiting for us in Seattle. When we arrive, the plane gets enough fuel to fly to Mexico City. She nodded, then got up to leave. "Oh, one more thing," I added quietly. She froze. "Another bourbon, please. I'm parched." She quickly, but not nervously, turned around and headed for the cockpit. That's when I discovered that waiting patiently is the most nerve-wracking thing a person can do in a stressful situation. Everyone around me was peaceful. Most were families. Nearly all of them were certainly traveling for Thanksgiving the next day. They were either talking quietly or napping. Each person was pleasant and relaxed. The paranoia started bouncing around in my head then. How could I be the only one who understood that the entire plane had been taken hostage? I felt so fucking alone. Because they were in one world while I was in another at the back of the plane. And it was getting way too hot when no one else noticed. Hot just like in Saigon during the summer when the plane we were flying came in too low for the landing, but we realized too late, and all I could do was be grateful that I was in the back of the cabin with the ground coming up too fast in the heat. I gasped quietly as the overhead speaker crackled to life. I quickly wiped the tears away as the captain spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, please be advised that our plans to land in Seattle have been changed." I forced myself to be calm. The only way that I could deal with the flashbacks were to force them deeper inside, and I had gotten quite good at it. I did not understand at the time just how profoundly I was damaging myself. "Due to a minor technical difficulty, our arrival time will be delayed for a few minutes. We apologize and thank you for choosing Northwest Orient." The captain signed off without another word. The crowd murmured quietly. I saw the girl in the blue dress lay her head down on her mother's lap. Mom gently brushed her untamable frizz, and I found myself thinking of Jasmine and Flower. I was causing this. I was the reason that these families had now become negotiable hostages. My head spun and I suddenly wanted out. No. I was not the reason for this horror. This was squarely the responsibility of a few soulless men who saw my wife as a financial transaction instead of a human being. Well, I thought, as I pulled a pair of sunglasses from deep inside the briefcase. A hell of a transaction is what they're about to get. The stewardess, I later found out that her name was Florence, came back and sat down next to me. She informed me that everything had been relayed to the appropriate people, and that preparations were being made. I nodded, then handed her a $5 bill. She looked at it like I was offering a particularly large beetle. "What's that?" She cringed. I gazed at her in confusion. "I got 2 drinks. $1.90 with the Coke, $1.30 without it." That was when I realized I wasn't a customer to her. Not anymore. I was a monster, and monsters don't play by the rules of normal people. Why wouldn't I just steal my drinks, given how horrible a person I clearly was? She took the bill incredulously, and even tried to give me change. Florence thought I wanted every penny I could steal. I finished the bourbon in a single gulp. The next hour was a painful wait. Florence was the consummate professional, keeping me abreast of the situation as she moved back and forth between the pilot and me. A nervous energy buzzed through the passengers. I watched the landscape below as we circled around Seattle. The sun sets pretty early that time of year, and it wasn't long before twinkling city lights were the only challenges to the Pacific Northwest darkness. "We're ready," Florence announced as she shattered my thoughts. The flashbacks had been dormant for the moment, but I had learned to accept that they were around every corner, and always would be. I took a deep breath. Good. Let's land this plane. It was surreal watching everyone bow to my wishes. All of the window shades were pulled down to hide what was going on inside. We pulled to a far-off, brightly lit section of the airport, so that I could see what was happening outside. The passengers' murmurs were shifting towards panic. "Why is that truck refueling us? Can we get off? I want to go home." I closed my eyes, but the images I found there were worse. So I opened them and focused my attention outside. My heart stopped. The truck had quit refueling. Florence sat down next to me. I forced my breathing under control. There's a problem getting the fuel in. Northwest Orient has requested permission to try a different truck. Perhaps they were calling my bluff. If so, there was no card I had left to play. That's fine, I offered in a voice far too calm for how I felt. When the second truck had the same issue, I had basically given up. They were clearly testing my limits. They wanted to see if I was real. Sure, it put a few dozen airline passengers at risk, but would the man sitting atop a huge corporation love $200,000 more than a human being? Please, my wife had said. Trust me, I had offered back. Yes, these people would certainly roll the dice with a handful of lives when enough money was on the table. I wondered if they would let me out of prison long enough to say goodbye to my wife before she died. I knew, of course, that they wouldn't. When Florence sat down next to me once more, I was mentally preparing to surrender. A Northwest Orient representative was just delivering the money in parachutes, she explained calmly. It's all on board awaiting your inspection. We would like to know if the passengers are free to go home. My controlled exterior masked an internal storm. What was real? When the passengers left the plane, nearly all of my bargaining chips would go out with them. I checked the money and parachutes. They were genuine. There was nothing left to do except decide. I looked down the aisle at the girl in the blue dress. She had her arms wrapped around her mother, but she was staring at me. The look on her face was one of pure horror. I nodded. Let them go. Florence signaled in the direction of the cockpit, and the passengers came to life. Only she and I remained still. I'm letting you go too, I explained softly. Florence looked gravely back at me. I understand that, Mr. Cooper. But you're not letting everyone go. And some of my friends are staying behind as your hostages. I nodded curtly, but said nothing. So, could you explain something to me? She drew a deep breath. Why are you keeping 5 people on the plane, despite requesting only 4 parachutes? Calmly, I took out a cigarette, lit it, and blew a soft stream of smoke into the air above my head. Do me a favor, Florence. Just make sure that everyone does exactly what I say. You can have anything you want, Mr. Cooper, the co-pilot explained. I probably would have laughed if I were capable of movement, but the numbness of shock held all facial expressions to inaction. If I could have had anything I wanted, I certainly would not have been sitting with 4 strangers in the cabin of a nearly empty plane at 7:13 p.m. on Thanksgiving Eve, with a bomb in one bag and $200,000 in another. I quietly took a long drag from my cigarette, let it out slowly, and stared at the space between pilot and co-pilot. With my dark glasses on, they couldn't tell where I was looking at any given time. I need to get to Mexico City, I deadpanned. But there are conditions. Here's where I need to backtrack a bit. As I mentioned earlier, my wife had spent 10 years working for Northwest Orient in their manufacturing division. It was no coincidence that I had chosen that airline to hijack. My wife had first shown symptoms of lung cancer after breathing in so many chemicals in their plant that she had to retire early. They had denied her workers' compensation claim in order to save money. As I stared at the bag of cash that Northwest Orient had surrendered to me, I reflected on just how poor a choice they had made in this particular money-saving endeavor. You see, lung cancer isn't the only thing that my wife had brought home. As a supervisor on the plant floor, she had intimate knowledge of and access to airplane design. If she'd been born half a century later, the world would have encouraged that woman to study engineering. Despite my bigger paycheck, she was smarter than me by far. Throughout our marriage, I would smile and nod as she described her workday, then mindlessly help her store the excess paperwork that she sometimes brought home. The first time I had really paid it any mind, however, was just before this excursion. And the paperwork I found contained a lot of information about the 727 aircraft. There was even a placard with instructions for opening the airplane's stairs. "What are your conditions?" the pilot asked warily. I swiveled my head just enough to let him know I had heard him. "I need you to fly at the slowest possible speed necessary to keep us in the air. Keep the wing flaps low and don't pressurize the cabin." The flight engineer, in the 1970s, that was one of the cockpit employees, looked at me like I had 2 heads. He stared at the parachutes, then back at me, and simply said, "No, not in the rain and the dark. Not here, not now." I snuffed out my cigarette. "Is there going to be an issue with my requests?" The captain cleared his throat. "If we follow all those particular instructions, it will severely restrict our flight efficiency. It's unlikely we'll be able to go more than 1,000 miles without needing a fuel stop." "Then we'll take a fuel stop," I responded simply. "Where would you need us to land?" The pilot and co-pilot leered at one another. I don't think that either one of them truly believed that this conversation was actually happening. Surely they would be awakened from a fevered dream soon enough, and the world would be restored to its proper state just in time for breakfast. The co-pilot offered. "I think it would be pushing things to reach McCarran in Las Vegas, so if it is necessary to make multiple refueling stops, then that is what we'll do. What airport is on the way to McCarran?" "Reno Tahoe is the furthest I would be comfortable traveling under these conditions," the pilot quietly responded. "If that's what you feel is best for the aircraft, then I will accept it," I explained calmly. "Now let's get moving. This flight's been delayed long enough." And with that, the cockpit crew got up to fly the plane back toward Reno. The heart of any con, you see, is getting the target to believe that it was his idea all along. A flight attendant waited in the cabin with me while the cockpit crew closed themselves in. Her name was Tina, and she was clearly terrified to be left alone with me. I wanted to comfort her, but I knew that would be impossible because of how I looked. And I hated the fact that I wanted to do the right thing, but she saw me as violent. Yet I know she was even a little intrigued, and I wanted to ensure her that the streets of Da Nang were safe, because we were here doing the right thing when a gunshot came out of where... And the woman's head exploded like a watermelon. The plane left the ground with a jolt, and I was gasping for air. I said, "Are you okay, Mr. Cooper?" Tina asked from 3 seats away. How bad must I have looked if she was actually concerned for my well-being? I nodded quickly, tried and failed to force a smile, then reached for another cigarette. "Thank you for your concern, Tina. You've done everything I asked, and you've done it well. I sincerely apologize for any difficulty I've caused you." I blew a stream of smoke through my nose. "Now that we're up in the air, please join the cockpit crew. I'm going to need you to remain there throughout the flight." She looked at me with... what was it? Concern? Then she nodded and headed wordlessly into the cockpit. I was alone. I took the opportunity to finish my cigarette, because I knew damn well that it might be my last. We fear death greatly enough to build faiths around its escape. But the overwhelming majority of what makes life worth living is just the damn everyday pleasures that we disregard in fleeting moments. The cumulative impact of those diminutive joys is great enough to drive 99% of our waking hours. It defines us more than do our own names. So I relaxed. For 5 minutes. Until the cigarette went out on its own schedule. Then I got to work. I reached deep into the briefcase. It was large and spacious, and it held all I needed. I pulled out the placard and set it aside. Then I removed the tightly packed duffel bag and unfolded it. I quickly shuffled the money into my own duffel from the easy, recognizable knapsack Northwest Orient had used. Let me tell you, $200,000 is a lot of cash. It was a tight squeeze, but I fit everything in. Well, almost everything. I set 3 of the money packets aside. Then I pulled the change of clothes from my briefcase. I took off my tie and threw it onto a seat, then quickly stripped down, glancing warily at the cockpit door the entire time. Once I was naked, I threw on the new set of clothes and crammed the old ones into the briefcase. I couldn't fold them neatly because I was shaking too much, so they barely fit. After that, I grabbed my knife from inside the briefcase, pulled open one of the parachutes, and cut out a long stretch of cord. I turned back to the 3 loose packets of money, pulled out a single $20 bill, and slipped it into my pocket. I had left my credit card at home and spent nearly all of my cash driving to Portland. I realized then that I'd want access to money without opening my ransom stash in the middle of a godforsaken gas station. They probably wouldn't notice a single missing bill. But since 3 packets of money would hopefully turn up in the forest a few days from the hijacking, detectives would almost certainly stitch together the exact story that I wanted them to assume. I stuffed the 3 packets into the briefcase with the clothes, knife, and bomb, but I didn't latch it closed. I wanted it to burst open on impact and scatter its contents. Then I used the pilfered cord to bind the briefcase tightly around 2 of the intact parachutes. It was go time. Carefully following the instructions on the placard, I opened the rear door of the plane. The placard was instantly sucked from my hand and into the frozen night. The wind was forced out of my lungs as I grasped a nearby chair while the outside world opened with a vortex and a roar.
"Mr. Cooper,"
the intercom crackled.
"what are you doing? Do you need assistance?"
"I'm fine," I screamed over the howling wind, though I have no idea if they heard me. I plodded steadily to where I had left the parachute briefcase bundle, shakily picked it up. It was a heavy load. Then walked slowly back to where the open door was sucking air into its maw with violent ferocity. I struggled to balance as I teetered on the edge of the exposed stairway. The roar was deafening, as though the night itself was screaming in protest. I had to get this just right. I aimed, heaved, and prayed. The parachutes and briefcase sailed through the air and slammed down hard on the bottom step. The cord was useless, and the entire bundle burst open. Then it disappeared in an instant. That's when I lost my balance and pitched forward. For a second, I was floating, and the fragility of every damn thing in the world was just so crisp and clear in that moment that I wanted to cry. I caught hold of the handrail and squeezed tight enough to peel the skin off my hand. For an instant, I hung at the screaming edge of oblivion, knowing that I had been mere inches away from falling hopelessly into the faraway night. I clutched the handrail as the whirlwind of rain and wind spiraled around me, clawing at my grip and trying desperately to pull me out into the night sky. I could feel the world telling me just how little my own life mattered to the engineers of a much greater plan. But I fought against the sensation in the same way that I had battled uphill with every new development since my wife's diagnosis. I forced myself upright. I pulled my leg up a single step, then another, and another after that. I was back in the plane.
"Mr. Cooper!"
the intercom screamed.
"Mr. Cooper, the aft door is open. Do you need assistance?"
Everything now hinged on whether the crew would follow the final instructions I had given them before they'd entered the cockpit. Under no circumstances shall you open the cabin door before landing to refuel. You will be tempted to do so. Please remember that I can initiate the bomb just by dropping the briefcase. No emergency is worth destroying the plane. Do not test me. They continued to shout, and I continued to ignore them. The only real protection I had at this point was their fear of me. And despite my bomb being imaginary, that fear proved to be a weapon that was very real in its own right. I walked away from the door and stepped past the 2 remaining parachutes. The only property of mine left in the plane was $194,000 in the duffel bag that I had brought from work. For a moment, I froze in contemplation of this fact. I had actually done it. Well, not quite yet. I was, after all, still on the plane. But the thought of succeeding actually started to feel real. I might not, after all, grow old entirely alone. I snatched up the duffel and stepped away from the parachutes, certain that someone else would be happy to dispose of them on my behalf. Then I climbed across the seats and headed towards the 727's crew rest compartment. When I got there, I waited, and I prayed. It took 2 hours for us to arrive in Reno. They were, without a doubt, the longest 2 hours of my life. I wanted nothing more than for the wait to end. Then the plane descended. Adrenaline kicked my pulse into overdrive. I wondered if it was possible for my heart to crack my ribs from the inside. Suddenly, I didn't want the wait to end. But it turns out that time just didn't care about my priorities. I stood up and grabbed the bag as the plane taxied to a stop. The whiteness in my knuckles spread across my hand as I prepared myself for what was going to happen next.
"Mr. Cooper, are you there? The FBI has requested to board the plane. If this will cause you to detonate the bomb, you need to let us know now. Please respond, Mr. Cooper."
For a moment there was silence. Then there was none for a long time. The door in the front of the plane burst open to screams of, "FBI!" Footsteps ran through the center aisle as I heard the cockpit door hit the cabin wall, followed by yelling from inside. Like dominoes, noise tore across row after row as it drew toward me. I took a deep breath and shouted. "Crew rest compartment's clear," I called as I jumped forward. The nearest FBI man whipped around and aimed an assault rifle at me. Then he looked down at the clothes I had changed into. The clothes that I had brought from work. Reno PD! What the fuck are you doing in this aircraft? You're on fucking ground support right now! He yelled at another FBI agent near him. Rika, get this shithead off my plane, and make someone's head roll for this! The man obeyed without question, shoving me violently down the aisle towards the exit. I stepped out into the cool night air, and saw one of the greatest sights of my life. Hundreds of people were gathered in the rain. Lights shone on FBI and Reno PD running around in a frenzy. But there must have been half a dozen different agencies present. I scrambled down the stairs, bag in hand, and moved to get lost in the crowd. Whoa there, pal, the FBI man said as he grabbed my arm. Just who the fuck are you now? My breath stopped. I tried to take in air, but my lungs refused to cooperate. Christensen! Rackstraw! We got someone! Two men in FBI gear ran toward me, as the agent clutching my arm started barking information into his walkie-talkie. Finally, I found my voice. Get my captain, he'll explain everything. This is Reno PD jurisdiction, please. The man shook my arm forcefully. Fortunately, the duffel was in my other hand. The fuck are you saying, man? He told me to get in the plane. You're interfering with direct orders from my captain. He looked at me like I was something foul he had scraped off his shoe. Then he stared hard at my uniform and yelled fresh information into his walkie-talkie. Obviously, the captain of the Reno Police Department was at the scene. When he arrived and identified me, the FBI quickly lost interest and left me to my boss. He was not so dismissive. You were in the goddamn plane? He asked desperately. I just lied to the FBI to save both our asses. Are you trying to get us fired? I stared at the ground. The best way to handle an angry person is to let them talk uninterrupted, and I did that now. But it was a busy night, and he didn't have much time for me. I don't know what to say, I offered when he was done. I haven't been the same since my wife's diagnosis. My head's not on right. He softened just a little. Look, this is not the time to lose control of yourself. Just leave. There's been a hijacking. We don't have time for fucking around. Go on home to your wife. There was more disappointment than compassion in his voice. I nodded, turned, and walked away without another word. As I was leaving, the captain looked down at the bag I was carrying. I had been careful to select one that prominently displayed Reno Police across the side. Wait, he screamed. What are you carrying? I pretended I hadn't heard him, and quickly slipped into the rushing crowd of people. I darted out of sight as fast as I could manage without drawing undue attention, and I never looked back. My uniform enabled me to walk calmly past the police barricade. Andy was guarding it, and I waved at him as I carried the ransom money away from the airport and toward the rental car I'd left in the parking lot 3 days earlier. I couldn't relax during the entire drive home. I needed to see my wife before letting my guard down and believing that the night was actually over. And when I parked in front of our house, the warm light glowing in the kitchen told me implicitly that everything was going to work out. I smiled. I was home. I went quietly through the front door, set the money down, and headed for the most needed hug of my life. When I didn't find my wife in the kitchen, I headed to her bedroom and flicked on the lights. She was lying on the floor, eyes glassy with a trickle of blood leaking from her mouth. The wrongness of that sight prevented me from understanding what I was seeing at first. Then I screamed. I grabbed my wife and shook her limp body. Her head lolled sickeningly back and forth, but she gave no signs of life. In a blurred panic, I picked her up and ran for the front door. I made sure to grab the duffel bag of money on the way out. The rainy, hairy drive to the hospital was the most dangerous thing I did that night, but I'm certain we arrived faster than an ambulance could have. They admitted her right away, and I was ushered into a sterile gray room filled with magazines and the crying families of dead people. I couldn't just wait, so I ran to the reception desk. You need to give her the best doctors. The chemotherapy, radiation, everything. Please, I have money, all the money you could... Sir, the woman behind the desk said politely but firmly. Money isn't the solution to this problem. She sighed. I promise you that our doctors and nurses are doing everything they can. Please, have a seat and wait for what's next. And then there was nothing left to do but sit. Part of me was numbly shocked that everyone else went about their business like this was just an ordinary day, and not the most horrible thing in my life. I wondered how many people at any given moment are experiencing the worst pain they've ever felt, and how much it would mean for an unaffected world to act like it cared just a little bit. The beginning of a story, you see, is the best place for a naive fool to be. Most significant journeys would remain untaken if the traveler knew just how bad the most painful part would hurt. That's when I looked up and saw a vaguely familiar face. I needed to break the loneliness before the last vestiges of sanity finally slipped through my fingers, so I nearly ran to her. Then I recognized who it was. Tina, the terrified stewardess from the plane, was leaving one of the rooms. Since I hadn't physically hurt her, she must have checked into the hospital as a direct result of the terror that I had caused. The look on her face made it clear that she'd been crying. A flashback was coming up fast. If she recognized me during an episode, the FBI would have me in handcuffs before I recovered. I sprinted out of the hospital, leaving my wife to an unknown fate. After 12 hours had passed, I couldn't wait any longer. I went back to the hospital on Thanksgiving morning and headed to my wife's room. She had not regained consciousness. The doctor was with her. He looked grim. The exact details of the conversation were wiped from my memory in a deluge of anger and pain. I know that I begged the doctor, that I promised him money, and that it had no effect. The cancer had just gone too far. What had been done could not be undone. He left me alone in the room so that I could have some time with her. I knelt down and interlocked her fingers with mine. I told her that I was sorry, that I had tried, that I needed forgiveness for failing. I begged her to wake up just once to tell me goodbye. I had to let her know how hard I'd fought. I had to. I couldn't let her go while she believed that I'd been doing something pointless. I wouldn't accept the notion that she had been alone when the world turned itself off to her. Yet, cancer didn't care what I wouldn't accept. The most wanted man in America, and ostensibly the most dangerous, cried helplessly as an arbitrary arrangement of cells ruined his life forever. She never woke up again. My wife died that night after being alone for 3 days. I won't ever know what her final conscious moments were like. But if she loved me as much as I had loved her, it would have been agonizing to die without the person who made her world go round. I left the hospital that night, grabbed the money, and never returned to Reno. I called my captain and told him that I couldn't go back to a life that would never be as good as it had once been. He said he understood, and we never spoke again. The entire country was looking for me, so I found a forgotten corner of the southwestern U.S. and stayed out of sight. I bought a tiny abode in the desert for dirt cheap, and didn't touch the ransom cash for years. I lived off of prior savings, because the serial numbers of the stolen money had been sent to every bank that used American currency. After 3 years, I decided it was time to head over to the local rundown medical clinic. Hi. I'd like to pay for everyone's bill, please. That had, after all, been the original intent for the money. After treating the day's 26th patient, the head of the clinic pulled me aside. I can't help but wonder about this cash, he said warily. Well, I responded coolly. It's good to maintain a sense of wonder. That was the end of our conversation. I grew old. The most terrifying part about losing my wife was the fear of spending the next half-century alone. That fear proved valid. It wasn't the type of gut-punch horror that sends the pulse racing, though. Instead, it was an almost numb sensation that I experienced while moments passed by that should have been shared with someone. No moment can ever be truly replicated, and once gone, it's dead forever. Those moments are quantified and finite, and mine were irredeemably diminished versions of what they could have been. I had no one to comfort me when I was diagnosed with advanced esophageal cancer last month, and I have no one to inherit my fortune. That part isn't so bad. I spent all but the last $1,913, and I've left enough clues in this text for anyone to find it. It's nothing to get very excited about, though. You can't take it with you when you go. In the end, all I really wanted was to grow old amidst the lingering scent of jasmine and flower. But I guess the world decided that was just too much to ask. So I stand at the edge of the faraway night, wondering if there are answers to be found in a faith-filled leap. But mostly certain, there's only darkness. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Grupe Horror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.